In 1940, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the world was saved by two aircraft designs and a handful of pilots. As the crushing tide of Nazism crested on the banks of the French coastline that summer, England stood alone, its allies plundered and destroyed. The Germans had won easy victories everywhere, from Poland in 1939 to the conquest of France in only 40 days a year later. In the Battle of France, England had been hit hard. Most of its army barely escaped at Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force had sent a strong contingent of squadrons to help out the French almost as soon as the war broke out. These RAF units, dubbed the Advanced Air Striking Force, were thrown into the cauldron of battle in May of 1940. In just a matter of weeks, those squadrons were all but wiped out, with a loss of over 900 planes. Even worse, many of the RAF's most experienced pilots were killed or captured during that disastrous month. Arthur Deacon, a Hurricane pilot with 242 Squadron, was one of those unlucky pilots.
When I got hit, I thought, well, if I jump, if it catches fire, I'll jump. And I put the hood back, and I undid my harness. And I was just off the Belgian coast. But gosh, if I can just get to the Belgian coast, I'll be all right. I just got to the coast, pulled back on the stick, nothing there, and they went straight in. Fortunately, I had put the hood back, undid my harness. I was catapulted out into the garden of a hospital. Once again, God said, look, I'll give you one more chance.
The gravity of the situation, he agreed. No further units would be sent to France. Germany and its mighty blitzkrieg war machine now stood poised to conquer all of Europe. All that barred their path to total victory was the English Channel and what was left of RAF Fighter Command. With its 49 squadrons of Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires, Fighter Command would prove to be Britain's last line of defense that summer of 1940. Those two aircraft, the ones which would soon save England and change the course of World War II, were pre-war designs dating back to the mid-1930s. The Hawker Hurricane first flew in November of 1935 as the Royal Air Force's first monoplane fighter. Faster than any RAF airplane of the day, the Hurricane prototype exceeded 300 miles per hour in level flight. 2 years later, the Hurricane 1 entered service. Pilots quickly learned to love the new plane, both for its ruggedness and its maneuverability.
I was posted north to Carlisle to 51 OTU, Operational Training Unit, which got you ready for operations, and I flew Hurricanes there. I thought it was great. Oh, wonderful plane. There's lots of power, and it was just you, nobody else. And it was a great airplane, I thought.
It wasn't as fast as the Spit, but it was more maneuverable, and it was more solid. It was a rugged aircraft. You could land it without any trouble, anywhere, any field.
The Hurricane was a better gun platform. It was a steadier aircraft when the guns were firing than the Spitfire was. And it was a very stable aircraft, considerably slower than the Spitfire. But it flew well, it was comfortable to fly.
I thought it was a wonderful aircraft. It was gentle to fly, beautiful aircraft. So, very responsive to the controls. And it was the earliest aircraft to be in the Battle of Britain. In fact, most of the Battle of Britain, you hear, like in films and that it was mainly done by Spitfires, but it was mainly Hurricanes because there were more of them. The Hurricane was just an ideal, like a gentleman's aircraft.
At the same time, however, a new aircraft was joining operational squadrons. This was the Supermarine Spitfire. destined to be one of the war's greatest designs.
People think of the Spitfire and the Hurricane as being in the same generation. They actually not. The Spitfire is really a generation more modern, in a way, a generation more modern than the Hurricane, although they both use the same engine. But the Hurricane was from the tube and fabric type aircraft, following the previous designs of biplanes by the same designer, whereas the Spitfire was into the all-metal monocoque aircraft, higher performance, very maneuverable. It was very versatile. Bubble-top Spitfires, long-wing Spitfires, short-wing Spitfires. It went through a series of upgrades. It went to the Griffin engine. The speed went up. Everything went up. The Spitfire had a lot of growth to it, and it was an excellent fighter.
Wonderful. It got the height, the speed, a little more speed, and the height. Beautiful two-stage. Stanley Hooker designed it, Rolls-Royce. Beautiful thing, two-speed, two-stage supercharger. And so all the Spitfire needed was that. And see, it could turn inside both of them with ease. Couldn't roll with a 190, nothing could. Well, 190 was the best roller in the world, but you know, it only rolled so far.
The Spitfire has an elliptical wing, a very broad surfaced wing. And this creates a tremendous drag if you do a very sharp turn in the Spitfire. This tremendous surface, air buffer surface, gets up against the air that you're trying to propel through, and it really makes the airplane turn sharply. It can turn so sharply that you can black out very easily. The G force of that turn, if you're not knowledgeable about the airplane you're flying, you can put yourself in the black there for a moment or two.
I used to say, I'm going to strap on a Spitfire, and you know, that's the way it is. You are a part of that aircraft, and it's a delightful thing to fly, and you feel a part of the aircraft. It's not strange to you once you know how to fly them, and it's a very, very nice aircraft.
In the air, it was a marvelous airplane. It was beautifully stable. It was very light on controls. It had the standard wing version that I flew had a very favorable stall. It wasn't at all dangerous. And it was a very comfortable airplane to fly.
You don't fly a Spitfire, you wear it. And it's just so comfy and so small and so neat and so compact. You know, it's just a lovely little airplane.
I dearly love the Spitfire. Ask me what I thought of it to fly. It was sheer poetry, just sheer poetry. Terrible on the ground, horrible brakes, but once you got them in the air, it was like flying a poem.
The new fighter, for all its performance, did have some tricky quirks that made it difficult to operate.
On takeoff and landing, you had to be very careful because it had a tendency to ground loop quite easily, so you had to be careful. On takeoff, you certainly could not push the power to it too rapidly or you just turn right off the runway. And on landing, you had to be ready on the rudder because it could tend to ground loop. And let's say you did a ground run and you pulled up, and then you only wanted to pull up so far and you pitched forward, so you've got negative G now, the engine would cut out momentarily. So you had to be careful of that. And also the propeller was fairly close to the ground, so when you were up in this position, your propeller's only got about an inch clearance.
While the Hurricane could not hope to match the German Me-109E in performance, the Spitfire's agility and speed gave its pilots an almost equal chance against the Nazi fighter.
The Spitfire pilot, other than when he was inverted, was flying a beautifully balanced, beautifully controllable machine, and when he got in a tangle with an ME, it became a contest of who could wrap around the barber pole the tightest, and the Spitfire always would win because you could bring that spade grip right back in your gut, and you were just shuddering and jaking all the way around the turn like that, and you had to kick it to make it go into a spin. So there you are, just a marvelous, marvelous flying machine.
By 1940, both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were in full production, just in time for the Battle of Britain and their epic moment in the sun, where these two aircraft types and their pilots would play David to the Luftwaffe's daunting Goliath.
Against the British airfields are highly successful. Several of these airfields are severely damaged and put out of commission even, and the losses among the RAF fighter command are extreme and very, very serious. It looks like the Germans are going to win this campaign in the initial days.
Luckily, the Germans made a number of tactical errors. The most significant was how their fighters provided escort.
The 109Es were, of course, they would go a little bit higher than the Spitfire. The engine slightly rated a bit higher, and they were lighter. But, of course, Goering made that famous, foolish mistake of listening to his bomber pilots and keeping his fighters all grouped in close. I think that's why they lost it.
To 300 Polish airmen, mostly pilots, succeeded in crossing the Romanian border and from Romania to France, where they fought again in the French Air Force, where when France was in turn invaded, and then from France, almost all of them who were alive at the time were able to reach England and play a very vital part in the Battle of Britain.
The infusion of Polish and also Czech pilots helped with the shortage of men to fill the empty.
Counts. The Luftwaffe was not fighting a strategic air war in the Battle of Britain, nor should it have. In fact, its objectives were very limited and really centered around gaining control of the air over the English Channel and the southern English beaches. Had they been able to do that for any reasonable amount of time, they would have been able to land an invasion force in England and probably win the war. But as this grand tactical counter-air operation evolved, the Germans lost sight of the objective and drifted away from the effective targets that they had been hitting. Well, ultimately, that drift, that loss of focus, cost the Germans the battle and ultimately cost them the war as well.
At the end of August, the turning point came. A Luftwaffe air raid got lost over England and accidentally dropped its bombs on London. Churchill ordered immediate retaliation. Bomber Command responded by raiding Berlin a few nights later. Hitler was outraged. Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, was embarrassed. Both had visceral, emotional reactions to the attack. For its gall to attack the Nazi capital, England would be bombed flat. London would now be the Luftwaffe's target. Soon, London was being bombed around the clock. The Great Blitz was on.
In London, when the air raid sirens went off, we all dived for shelter. If they started to bomb near where you threw yourself in the gutter. I was at a nightclub with Fred one time when the bombers came over, and you could hear this whoomp, whoomp, and he went under the table. And I said, "What are you doing under there?" He said, "It's better to give than receive." He was being funny. We all had a lot of black humor, you know. You had to. It was the best of times and the worst of times. If you could get away, you went to London, blitz or no blitz. There were nightclubs full of servicemen. Everything was dark. Everything was blacked out. But life went on, and it was a high old time. A lot of young men that had come through the Depression or come off farms were now officers, leaning around on bars, being big wheels, you know. And girls were anxious to meet them. And it was a wonderful time, wonderful dances, wonderful things going on. You just dodged the bombs.
Subsequent raids attacked outlying cities and towns as well as London. Pat Ashbaugh remembers one terrible afternoon in Reading.
I was going downtown to meet my young brother, and down the hill, and I heard the sound of an engine. Now, the German aircraft engines had their own particular sound. We hated it. It was terrifying. And I looked up, and just within eyesight there was an aircraft with a white cross on it. Just there, you know, a horrible feeling. And suddenly there's like eggs tumbling out of the sky and puffs of smoke, and I started to run and got down to the town square, and they had bombed this big restaurant that was called the British Restaurant, and it was jam-packed, and it was direct hit, and it was horrible. I met my young brother throwing up in a doorway, and we helped as much as we could.
The London Blitz proved to be a disaster for Germany. The English capital absorbed thousands of tons of bombs, but morale never cracked, and the British redoubled their efforts to carry on the war. Even worse, the attacks diverted the Luftwaffe away from fighter command's airfields. With the pressure off its Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons, the RAF had time to regroup and pour replacements into the frontline outfits. When the Germans returned to southern England's skies in mid-September, they found Fighter Command reinvigorated and waiting.
If Germany can take Britain out at this point, then they'll be able to focus all of their military power against the Soviet Union, which is what Hitler wants to do anyway. And if they're able to do that, there's a very high probability that they're going to take the Soviet Union out as well before the United States can even become involved in this war and make the difference that it does. So what the RAF is doing at this point is buying time for the whole world, and that time is a luxury that Germany doesn't have.
In 9 days, from September 11th to September 20th, the RAF shot down or damaged 266 German planes, losing only 153 in return. And by the end of October, the Battle of Britain was over. Fighter Command had saved England, and thus probably saved all of Western civilization from the jackboot of Nazi terror.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Once the Battle of Britain ended, the Royal Air Force wasted no time in taking the offensive. Initially, small groups of bombers, mainly Bristol Blenheims, formed the tip of the spear and were sent to attack targets in France. Swarms of Hurricanes and Spitfires escorted these fragile craft. These raids, dubbed mulberries, were conducted day in and day out. Soon, the fighting across the Channel became a grim war of attrition. Rod Smith describes how dangerous these missions could be.
At Dunkirk, to give top cover for some Blenheims that were bombing a railway yard or something. Yes, in France, not very far away. Claims were, by the Germans, very accurate, 15 or 16. 2 for Galland, 2 for Pips Priller, 2 for Munkeberg, or hot shots. It was JG-26, the best German fighter group ever.
Through 1941, these pinprick attacks on the Luftwaffe in France continued. It seemed a costly effort indeed, as some of the RAF's best remaining air leaders were shot down. One of those was the famed Douglas Bader, the legless wonder.
Bader was one of those people. I think he'd been very active in sports. He was a rah-rah pilot and got himself seriously injured in stunting in a plane, in a military aircraft, Bristol fighter, I believe it was. And he ended up having both his legs amputated, and he fought all the bureaucrats and the doctors and everything else to get back on flying status with 2 artificial legs. He was brought into 242 Squadron, and then later on he was commander of a wing and was shot down and damaged one of his legs in the crash and getting out of the aircraft. And it was a real pain in the neck for the Germans, because he kept, even with his artificial leg thing, or without artificial legs, he was trying to escape from hospitals and things like this. And they did parachute in a new set of legs for him. The Germans allowed them to do this. They, I guess, some prearranged arrangement. They dropped a new set for him, and he, of course, spent the war in POW camp.
As the sweeps and bombing raids continued over France, air fighting heated up in other theaters. In Egypt, the small Desert Air Force had helped turn the tide against the Italians by crushing their inept air force. With only a few squadrons of bombers along with a small force of Hurricanes, the Desert Air Force knocked out almost 1,000 Italian aircraft. The wreckage of Italy's air armada lay scattered across the Libyan landscape. Over Malta, some of the most intense air battles of the war took place.
The island of Malta is the critical point for the British in the Mediterranean theater. Malta is the only option the British have to be able to attack and interdict the Axis supply lines going into Africa. And so hanging on to Malta and making that a base is absolutely critical. And the real problem the British have is how do you get supplies and aircraft into the island? Because reinforcement is the only way they will win this intense air battle going on over the island.
Getting air reinforcements to Malta proved difficult indeed. In fact, the only way Spitfires could reach Malta was by aircraft carrier.
We were put aboard the Old Eagle. She was slow and short. They had a white line painted down the middle, so you had to keep on. Well, a Spitfire, you couldn't see the white line, but if it appeared to run away, you had to keep on that to make sure you're going to get your full length to take off. I was signaled off. I got airborne before the bow, and then we formed our 8 up and headed east.
Once at Malta, the pilots were greeted by a scene of modern siege warfare. Bomb craters were everywhere, and the people of Malta were living in caves, basements, or underground shelters. For the Spitfire pilots of Malta, there was no shortage of action. Day after day, small forces of bombers, covered by massive numbers of fighters, droned overhead and were engaged by the gallant defenders.
On July the 24th, we were scrambled to the usual 18,000 feet. And we were in perfect positioning. They were coming in just to the left of our squadron, and we were heading like that, close enough to them. There were 5 Ju-88s, and I took the one who was at my side, you see, and he and I, this 88 was up, we were close. And here we were slap over, well, just about the northern edge of Malta, or even closer in than that. It's a small little island, 17 by 9 miles. And there he was, and I was behind him, and up to his port engine, fired, and hit him with a port engine, and black and white smoke followed. The flame came out of that engine, and then I just went in through his wing root where the tanks are and aimed for the fuselage. And oh gee, fire and there were pieces coming off it, and big pieces. I think the flight was timed for me at 20 minutes. I got on the ground just like that. Well, the 88 got there before I did, of course, but it was burning some miles away to the southwest. Watched the guy in the parachute. I got down long before he did. Of course, I was glad to see him bail out. I didn't want to kill anybody.
For all their successes in the air, however, losses were very heavy. Yet the battle over the island continued, and in the process, many aces were made on both sides. One of those was George Buzz Burling, a Canadian pilot whose marksmanship was utterly uncanny.
George Burling, who is the highest scoring of the Canadian, aces, who made his war record really with the Royal Air Force, because he joined the RAF first and then later came over to the RCF. Everything I've heard from interviewing people who knew him, I mean, Burling was probably a sociopathic personality. He had exceptional talents for the job he was being asked to do, but probably was frightening in the sense that he loved it. and loved nothing else. That's the more critical element of it, is not just loving it, but nothing else even comes close. So now you're addicted. Now you're all that matters to you, all that mattered to Burling was to go out and fight every day.
The seesaw battle over Malta came to an end at the end of 1942. Though much of the island had been reduced to rubble, the defenders had held firm, driving the Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica from the skies. Again, the Spitfire and Hurricane played the critical role in turning back the Axis tide and changing the course of the war in the Mediterranean. While the Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command managed to hold off the Luftwaffe during the pivotal years between 1940 and 1942, a newer generation of fighters and fighter bombers were needed to strike back and take the offensive. The Hurricane was pressed into service as a fighter bomber in early 1941. With its massive firepower of 8 machine guns or 4 cannon, it was well suited for the role. But by 1942, the Hurricane was showing its age. Clearly, a new fighter bomber would be needed. 41.
The Typhoon we got on was a different engine altogether. It was a Napier Sabre, 12-cylinder sleeve valve engine, and they were opposed cylinders. You have to feature 2 banks of 6-cylinder engines, like top and bottom. They'd be opposed. 6 on this side, 6 here. Below was another 6 cylinders opposing another 6. They had 2 crankshafts, and all built into a central crankcase and geared. Each crankshaft was geared to the one that drove the propeller. So we had 2,300 horsepower driving the prop. So it was a different aircraft altogether to the Hurricane.
Big and powerful, the Typhoon was initially used as an air superiority fighter, much in the manner of the Spitfire.
Everybody thought the Typhoon was a fighter aircraft. No, it really wasn't. It couldn't turn inside of anything very much. It had its best performance, I think, was about, I think it was 10 or 14,000. At 28,000, you're just barely hanging on. So it really wasn't fit for sweeps.
Hawker Company put out the Typhoon, and that was supposed to be a fighter aircraft, and it could have been, except that it wouldn't perform at altitude where the other aircraft, the fighter aircraft, were. So it was reassessed as a ground-level fighter.
In this role, the new aircraft shined. Down low, the Typhoon was faster than anything the Luftwaffe could pit against it.
I know that I went through the air in sometime spring of 42, maybe it was May of 42, at 422 miles an hour, which is a hell of a speed. Now that's faster than, I think that was the fastest airplane in the world at that time.
By 1944, it had become the best British close air support weapon of the war.
I just thought it was the most wonderful aircraft ever. It was fast, it was big and tough, and delivered a terrific lot of, ammo too. But it was a wonderful airplane, and it was, as far as I was concerned, trustworthy.
Another fighter bomber produced during the war was the Bristol Beaufighter. It soon demonstrated that its versatility made it one of the best all-round planes of its day.
It was the most heavily armed aircraft in World War II. Their side or our side. It had 4 cannons under the pilot's seat firing forward. It carried 8 rockets. It had 6 machine guns in the wing. and I had one firing backwards at the back and could carry a torpedo or bombs also.
Nevertheless, it was a difficult aircraft to fly.
Once you got a bow in the air, it was a damn fine airplane, but getting one in the air was a very dangerous, hazardous proposition. They were a real pilot killer. And those first 20 to 40 seconds in the air were critical. Once you got past that stage, they were a very, very effective aircraft.
Initially used as a night fighter, the bow, as its pilots called it, became the Royal Air Force's standard ground attack and anti-shipping aircraft as well. With adequate speed and the ability to carry rockets or torpedoes, it filled all three roles to perfection. Bow fighters of Coastal Command carried out some of the most difficult operations of the war by attacking convoys of German merchant ships along the Norwegian coast. Flying at low altitude into the teeth of accurate light flak, the Beaufighter units would rocket, torpedo, and strafe ore-laden vessels and their escorts. It was vital work stopping the flow of raw materials into the Reich, but it was incredibly costly. In the China-Burma-India theater, the Beaufighter excelled as a heavy ground attack fighter. With its long range and heavy armament of cannon and machine guns, pilots could demolish Japanese targets on land and at sea.
I sank a couple of ships. I spotted the first one near Moulmein, went and attacked it, and we obliterated that ship. So we set out, and by golly, we got over to the, just before we get to Rangoon, there's another one, so we went in and got that one too. And so they were both loaded with Japanese soldiers being relieved and going out into Thailand.
While the Beaufighter earned its fame by being a jack of all trades, it was a master of none. But it was good enough to get the job done until other more specialized aircraft arrived on the scene. Following the end of the Battle of Britain in October of 1940, the Luftwaffe began a campaign of night terror bombing that lasted through much of 1941. At the time, the RAF had pitifully few resources available to counter these nocturnal attacks.
As these German night raids increased, the British began casting about for a solution to them and a counter. And they came up with the Balton-Paul Defiant, which had been a failed day fighter. And they pressed it into service as a night fighter, and it wasn't very effective for a number of reasons. It was too slow, it didn't have radar capabilities, and it just was not a very effective weapon. They also tried other day fighters like the Hurricane, and they guided these day fighters to the target with ground control and with the use of searchlights. But again, these weren't very effective at all. What was needed was some sort of a dedicated night fighter that had radar capability.
With direct interception by converted day fighters failing, the RAF took to intruder raids over the Luftwaffe's airfields in France. The idea behind these missions was to catch the German bombers as they were either landing or taking off. Such missions were originally carried out with the Douglas DB-7 Boston, or A-20 Havoc, as the U.S. Army Air Force called them.
We started on American aircraft made by Douglas. Now, these Douglas aircraft were called Havocs. It was a good aircraft. I must say, I rather liked the Havoc. Now, the Germans had a very unfortunate for them habit of turning on their navigation lights on final approach just before getting to the runway. So you had to hit them then, because before that, having no radar, you couldn't see them. So you could only see them as they were doing this final approach to land, and you were higher and somewhere, maybe not in the right spot. So the speed was of the essence, And when you finally caught up with them, not only were you flying much faster than they were, because they had their undercarriage down, their flaps down, and we were diving from maybe 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher. So the time between when you could fire and collision was extremely short, maybe a couple of seconds at the most. And in those 2 seconds, you had to pack enough ammunition into them to make their suffering on this planet easier, which we did. Of course, the sequel of that was that you were right over the ground, coming out of a dive at high speed, and that's when the fireworks started up. You know, the German airfields were heavily defended by flak and searchlights, all kinds of things coming at you. But it all lasted a very short time because you were traveling at high speed, so you were hard to hit, you were very low, so unless you collided with something, you had a fair chance to get away.
In 1941, the night air war was changed forever when the British were able to install airborne radar sets into the Bristol Beaufighter. With the plane's observer gunner now converted to radar operator, RAF Beaufighters now had the ability to stalk and track targets on their own.
A pilot was given the assignment to take off from an airstrip and go out into the British night, and I would do exactly what they told me to do. I would follow them, just listening to the radio and glued to my instrument panel, pitch black outside. What they were doing was putting me in behind him. Of course, he's changing too. So when they would think I should be in a proper position to detect the bandit on my airborne radar, they would call Smoky 1, punch, punch. And immediately my radar observer, listening to that, would turn his set on full gain, and if we were within, say, 8 to 10 miles, and if the bandit were ahead within say, an azimuth sweep of about 10 degrees either side, then he would be able to detect him. And then when we would get to within a distance of where he thought that I should be able to see it, and up until this time, you want to keep in mind that I'm glued to that instrument panel, and I've got just as low a light level in the cockpit as possible because I want to maximize my night vision. As I would approach, then he would call out, "Hey, fish, punch, punch," and I would look up. And at that point, I should be able to see the bandit. And if I did, I'd say, "Judy," and everybody would shut up while I shot. Well, I never did get one, but I saw a couple.
The Bristol Beaufighter was really the first true night fighter deployed by the RAF in World War II. And while it was an evolutionary step in the right direction, it wasn't the actual solution. The RAF needed a fighter that could operate at night, that was easy to fly, had a long range so it could operate in an offensive capacity as well, and the Beaufighter just didn't have those sort of characteristics. Down the road, a new fighter would take its place and eventually replace the Bristol Beaufighter, but it would take some time to get that in the field.
In 1942, a new weapon joined the night campaign. This was the de Havilland Mosquito, one of the war's most unusual designs.
Government threw a lot of cold water on it first because it was built of wood, mainly because it was a non-strategic metal, plus the fact that it was a traditional way that de Havilland had built some of their airliners and racers. Almost every role they used it in: photo reconnaissance, bombing, fighters, night fighters. It was an excellent aircraft. Had good range, good speed. I mean, it didn't need to be defended because it was faster than most of the things that were chasing it.
The Mosquito was a fantastic airplane, as I think anybody that flew it or flew in it would say, without a doubt. I feel very privileged to have been able to fly one.
The Mosquito aircraft, it's been said that it's been the most versatile of all military aircraft that have ever been built. It was used as a night fighter. It was used as a naval patrol plane, hunting submarines. They put a 57 millimeter cannon on board it for sinking submarines. They used it for bombers. It was the most successful bomber built during the war years. It raided Berlin 170 times during the war years, and that is in squadron strength. It carried a 4,000-pound, it's only a little aircraft, and yet it carried a 4,000-pound bomb all the way to Berlin, which is more, Americans couldn't carry 4,000 to Berlin with their fortresses.
Armed with cannon and machine guns in the nose and underside of the fuselage, the Mosquito proved to be a deadly fighter platform. With the navigator turned into a radar operator, the new night fighter could track and stalk German intruders more effectively than any other RAF aircraft, thanks to its amazing agility and 400-mile-per-hour top speed. In fact, the Germans were unable to produce an aircraft fast enough to catch the Mosquito until the advent of the jet-propelled Messerschmitt 262. In the night war, the Mosquito functioned in three main roles. It served as an intruder, replacing the Douglas Havoc in the airfield attack role, and as a night interceptor over England, picking off German intruders. Lastly, the Mosquito functioned as an escort fighter at night. Bomber Command's campaign to destroy German cities was meeting terrific opposition, and losses were prohibitive. To counter the German night fighters, Fighter Command began sending Mosquitoes to patrol the edges of the bomber streams.
What we tried to do at that time, find the edge of the bomber stream, and mind you, they'd be spread out for across 20 miles, and the length of the bomber stream from fore and aft would maybe 60 miles as this whole group's going up. You wouldn't know, we wouldn't know what the targets were or really what their track was. The ground controllers would see them, and they would vector us into the stream and put us on give us the vector of the stream, so we'd be on the side of the stream, and anything that crossed in, we would try to follow. But you'd get in amongst the aircraft, and they would be turning pretty sharply, trying to pick up targets, and you know, it was most difficult. I don't know of anybody that, well, there was a few pilots that had victories with German night fighters that way, but it was extremely difficult.
Such escort duties could prove to be very dangerous. Not only was it difficult to tell bomber from Luftwaffe night fighter, if the Mosquito crews dared chase a target into the bomber stream, they were apt to be attacked by their own side.
I got hit by a Lancaster tail gunner one night. I got about a dozen bullet holes out in the wing. And you just get too close to them. We were doing bomber support, and I never saw him. He was obviously watching me, and I was watching the navigator, watching something else. And as I swung, he was right there and nailed me.
Despite all the dangers, the Mosquito night fighter squadrons helped transform the war in the shadows. Few planes had such a dramatic effect on the war effort. And for the Mosquito crews, their legacy will be one of success and victory. Because the RAF's day fighter forces lacked the range to escort the heavy bombers into Germany and back, they were given new roles to perform. Concentrated into the 2nd Tactical Air Force, the RAF squadrons were assigned to soften up France in preparation for D-Day.
We were taking out the radar stations on the French coast there, Guernsey Island, and those French harbors. And then the V1 sites, we didn't know what they were really, but they called them no-ball targets, and we were going after them. But they were so well camouflaged, you know, you didn't know. So that's what we were doing prior to the invasion.
On D-Day itself, the 2nd Tactical Air Force flew a maximum effort to support the landings, while to strafe and bomb. Meanwhile, other RAF units attacked targets right ahead of the first waves as they landed on Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches.
Everything was scheduled to the minute. We were to attack, fly over, and attacked the defenses along the beaches 5 minutes before the barges landed on the shore. So we could see the guys actually getting out of the barges, and and the barges were coming and they were unloading them, guys heading for shore. And we were the last shot at trying to keep these German gunners' heads down and destroy any guns they had. And there's a building, they show this picture over and over again of pictures taken from a landing barge. And you can see this building straight ahead. Well, our target was a gun just to the east of that building. A built-in heavy emplacement, German emplacement. Unfortunately, we didn't get it quite knocked out, but it helped, So, nothing was guaranteed.
Flying just a few feet off the deck, pilots would sometimes have to pull up to go over tanks and German vehicles.
This is the first low-level attack by 56 Squadron, and when we were all waiting in the dispersal to come back, and they, oh great, 4 of them came over right on the deck, you see, and broke away and that. And someone said, just wait till Dougal gets in here, meaning wait for his story. See? Well, sure enough, in he comes. He says, you guys won't believe this, but I'll tell you what, I was flying right down the main street, and I was aiming at this gun placement, and just as I went by, a German jumped out, and I took off his head with my wing. Well, I really thought, oh. So we got the MO, and the MO came along and looked ashore. There's gray brains. Those are brains there on that wing, so he's right. So that's what we call low flying, and Dougal was right. He did knock somebody's head off with a wing.
In the final days of the Normandy campaign, the German army became trapped in the Falaise pocket. Squeezed into a smaller and smaller area, it became a house of carnage as the Typhoon squadrons demolished long strings of retreating Wehrmacht vehicles. Still, the Germans fought back with desperate ferocity.
I was going after some trucks and dove in there, and I got hit by a 20 millimeter. So I was pretty low down, but I managed to get up. And I managed to get out all right.
Captured by the Germans, Younger was force-marched through the Falaise pocket and witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of his fellow fighter-bomber pilots.
The slaughter was something fierce, It was trucks and tanks, half-tracks, everything you can possibly think of, and bodies all over the place, and dead cows. And the smell was pretty grim, too. And like old Eisenhower said, it was the biggest killing ground the world has ever seen, And he said, like he could walk for 100 yards on flesh. So it was a bad place.
The 2nd Tactical Air Force visited incredible carnage on the German army in Normandy, but they did so at a great cost. The German air defense capabilities built into their panzer units and some of their infantry units was just staggering. And as a result, over the campaign in Normandy, just the summer of 1944, 600 Typhoon pilots went down. That's just a phenomenal number, and yet the pace of operations never slacked off. And as the war moved deeper and deeper into France and Holland, the 2nd Tactical Air Force deployed to the continent to operate in even closer harmony with the Army. And through the rest of the war, they were involved in covering every single major operation the Allies launched on the Western Front.
In the war's final months, the 2nd Tactical Air Force suffered one more challenge, the introduction of the Me-262. Over 100 miles an hour faster than the latest Griffin-engine Spitfires, the Me-262 threatened all Allied aircraft. Nonetheless, some of the RAF's most experienced fighter pilots were able to tangle with the Me-262 and win.
Saw it coming, so I swung off to the right to allow myself room to get in behind him. And another guy, flight commander, he didn't swing so far. And when I went up behind the 262, he was in the way. But his number 2 got in behind it, and he hit it. in the port engine. I was almost going to collide with another flight commander, so we had to break off. And lo and behold, the 262 got pretty close to the ground, and then it came shooting up like that, came up to us, like that, almost vertically. So I just pulled in behind it like this, fired, and he caught fire, and he passed me on my right, went down and plunged into the ground.
Resourceful and determined to the end, the Royal Air Force helped drive the Luftwaffe from the skies in the war's final days as its fighter-bomber wings gave the enemy no respite. It had been a long, hard war for the RAF, but thanks to the excellent aircraft its pilots flew, Britain was able to stand against the Luftwaffe and push forward to final victory, shoulder to shoulder with the United States Army Air Force.
The British did the dirty work. They did the grunt work. They were involved in it from the get-go and to the final moments of the Third Reich, and they did it with kids. Their pilots were some of the youngest in World War II. They had 17-year-old guys flying Lancasters, 18-year-old fighter pilots that came and went. You had 22-year-old veterans who'd been fighting since they were 17 by the end of the war. And to me, it is a testament to these young kids that they were not only able to rise to the challenge and endure one of the most brutal sustained air operations in history, but also to emerge victorious.